On this show of St. Louis in Tune, we're going to talk about coffee with Mr. Coffee, except that name's been taken already. But the coffee situation, can you improve your cup of coffee? We'll find out how to do that. Also, the 9 top health reasons why you should drink coffee. There's been a man who's been spending his time underwater since March the 1st. We'll figure out what that's all about if we have time. And also Operation Resiliency, our word of the day, and humor, all on this episode of St. Louis in Tune. Well, greetings, listeners in Listenerland. Welcome to St. Louis in Tune with Arnold Stricker and Mark Langston, where we size up current and historic events involving people, places, and things in areas such as the arts, crime, education, employment, faith, finance, food, government, health, history, housing, humor, justice, and sports. We originate from and connect the gateway city to what is happening regionally, nationally, internationally, and galactically. A top of the day to you, Mark.
Top of the day to you. I'm not very good at that stuff, but top of the day. Top of the morning.
Top of the morning,
Top of the afternoon.
And sometimes we record the show at various times throughout the day, folks. At least we don't do it at 3 o'clock in the morning, though.
No. That's okay.
I forgot to add that we always do our return to civility.
We do, and it's about time to return.
Yes, and all of these things, this is from a Speed of Laughter project by John Sweeney. Great book, folks. Also, check out our episode on John Sweeney. We interviewed him, had a great time talking to him about that, and that's on stlintune.com. But if you're taking an elevator to the top of a building, send it back down after you reach your destination. Now, I didn't know this next fun fact. 81.63% of all elevator rides begin on the first floor.
Wow.
I guess unless you have a basement garage.
Right.
Then they would probably split between that. But in a regular building, nobody's going to enter on the 15th floor.
So your civility is suggesting when you get to the 50th floor, you press
1.
The lobby.
Right.
And send that rascal back.
Right.
Not press every one of the buttons.
As I'm sure you have done sometime in your career.
I know. I might have done that once or twice. Maybe just once.
Setting a great example for your children.
I've stopped my children from doing that before. When they were younger, they don't even think about it.
And then when they got off the elevator, you pushed them all.
I know. You were there. He's always there.
I think everybody in the morning takes time to have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. Some people like tea more than coffee.
I have the stained teeth to show it.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, one of the downsides of drinking coffee and things like that.
Or red wine.
Right, wine will do the same thing.
Yeah, so
all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But it does provide some health benefits, which we'll talk about later on in the show. But I alluded to Mr. Coffee, and we're not talking about the dispensing kind of machine. And I called him, that because he has this affinity and love for coffee that grew out of just drinking coffee, and it's grown into where he is now the Chief Coffee Officer for Goshen Coffee. And Tony Auger's in studio. Welcome, Tony, to St. Louis in Tune.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, I know I made that up about Mr. Coffee, but your background is you have a bachelor's degree from the New England Institute of Art. I'm like, how does this happen where you get this degree in art? And I don't know if it's in art history or whatever. And I want you to mention that. But then now you're this chief coffee, the CCO, the Chief Coffee Officer of a group that's here in St. Louis and over on the Illinois side.
Yeah. I always like to say nobody in coffee has a coffee degree. We all have some kind of art or, history degree or, an English degree of some sort. Because everyone kind of just stumbles into coffee, to be honest.
So how did you stumble into it?
Yeah, so after I got my degree, it was actually in photography.
Okay.
I was actually starting to work in other art. So I was working at a tattoo shop. And one morning I just realized I'm spending way too much money on coffee every day. I'd got to the point where I was kind of going down the rabbit hole a little bit and could taste the different things and had my aha moment, is what we call it in coffee, where you realize things can taste very different from cup to cup. And so I thought, I overheard someone in the coffee shop I was at interviewing for a job, and I just immediately was like, but I know more than this person. And then a light bulb went off where I said, well, instead of spending all this money on coffee, I could instead work in it and drink free coffee. Yeah, so
Great way to do that.
right, the typical user needs to be the supplier now, and right.
I love it.
And so for a really long time, I actually did both. I was working in the tattoo industry. I do that in the evening, and I'd work in coffee in the morning. Until one day, I was like, you know what? I want to make this my career.
Wow. That's very interesting. Now, you mentioned something I found interesting, and I also have been reading a little bit more about this, that, I liken what you do. I wonder if there's a sommelier of coffee, because it's just like when you are tasting wine, you can taste different kinds of flavors, and bourbon will do the same kinds of things, and so coffee does the same kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I'm actually one of those. It's called a Q grader.
Say that again.
A Q grader,
Okay.
a quality grader.
Okay.
It's a pretty rigorous test. A little different than wine. We always actually try to compare coffee to wine because we're studying the same things like different varieties and terroir and
Right.
all these elements that kind of go into coffee. The hard part is that for a very long time, coffee didn't have, I guess, kind of like a one-stop. This is how we do it across the world. Every little different micro region and community, they really didn't have a lot of money. They didn't know what they were doing, and they would do things based on like what their parents did and their grandparents did. So you would have like a farm next to a farm, and you could have some variance in flavors, but ultimately you wouldn't have, coffee from the country of Colombia always tastes the same, right? And so, in addition to that, there are a couple hundred different like flavor compounds in wine, but in coffee we have thousands.
Oh.
So it's also a little bit harder because it's not so hit you in the face, right? With wine, there's very clear,
Right.
Flavor profiles, and you can be able to say like, oh, I know this coffee is a Sauvignon Blanc from Washington, right? Whereas in coffee, you have to kind of taste over the inherent bitterness, right? There's a bitterness factor that's kind of like, that you have to then taste all the individual flavors above, and it just takes a little bit longer. You have to kind of build this mental library.
Well, let's really peel back the onion on this, and let's
Yeah.
start with the bean itself,
Yeah.
and go to the regions where coffee's grown, talk about the differences of those. I think there's two different types of beans, and then let's just kind of go through the whole process, because, my biggest question to you was what's the difference between dry roasting and how other kind of roasting's
Right.
done. But that was like, when I started researching this, it's like, well, that's just one section. I'm
Right.
just scratching the surface here. So let's go back to the beans.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of people don't realize this, but coffee's a seed. And so it grows on like a shrub. It's a tiny tree. The cherries that grow off that tree are about the size of a cranberry, but they can, depending on the variety, really change a lot in size. And what's inside that cherry are going to be two seeds. Each seed is kind of like a half moon shape, and it makes that circle. And so
Wow.
hundreds and thousands of years ago, somebody realized that if they roasted those seeds, they could turn it into a beverage. And so
That's
I know, right?
random.
I know.
I mean, who comes
thinks
up with
of
that
it? I know.
idea? I don't know. It's like,
Kind of
hey,
like using
Bob, let's
corn.
light a
Yeah.
Oh, let's heat this up. Oh, look at this. It's
I
alcohol.
know.
Yeah, I think what I think may have happened. Originally, they would actually take the fruit, and inside the fruit there's what we call a mucilage, and it's really sticky. It's kind of like honey, and it's very sweet. And they would take the fruit and they would leave the seed out of it, and they would crush it together and kind of make these like energy bars.
Right.
And I think they were like, well,
Ooh.
we don't want to waste the seed. How can we be able to consume this as well? Wow. But yeah, so I mean, with coffee, we have very similar again to wine or apples, grapes. You have all these different varieties, and each one's going to inherently taste different. The main thing that changes though is that, again, we're tasting the seeds. We're not tasting the fruit itself. When you find an actual coffee tree where it's grown, you can taste the fruit, and they do taste very different, which is a lot of fun. Wow. But really, so coffee, those differences that makes the biggest impact on change in flavor is going to be variety. You also have like the terroir, so like how high a coffee is grown and elevation. It's going to drastically change the way the flavor is. So
Crazy.
Will it be more bitter or
no? So something that's lower to the ground is going to be it's going to be more nutty, smooth. So you think like Hawaiian coffees or coffee from Brazil. They don't have a crazy complexity to them, but they're really sweet, smooth, got some nuttiness to them.
Wow.
The higher up elevation goes, the more complexity and acidity you're going to find in a cup of coffee. The main reason for this is that once you have those very high altitudes, coffee's going to kind of go through this cycle every day where it gets a lot of sunshine, and then it goes into a cold night, which shocks the coffee, and it thinks that plants actually can think, which is crazy itself, but it the plant itself is like, I'm going to die, like this environment I'm in is too much for me to handle. So instead of growing and like spreading its limbs and growing up high, it'll actually stay more compact, and it sends all of its nutrients to the seed itself instead of like actually growing as a tree.
Interesting.
Because it thinks, I need to propagate. I need to make sure that
I survive.
I survive, yeah. And so when we get seeds from that higher elevation, you're going to get a lot more intense flavors.
Wow.
Who knew?
Right.
Yeah.
I never knew.
That's why we're doing this show.
I know. I have so many questions for Tony. I know.
And one of the other main ways that coffee gets its unique flavors or how it's processed, right? I kind of like alluded to that before, where wine, they have a very strict, like, we're going to ferment for this long, and then we're going to be able to add this yeast microorganisms, things like that. But with coffee, I mean, that's the farmer. The farmer gets to pick that, and most of the farmers that I work with are operating on very small scale levels. So like maybe the size of a football field or 2 football fields, and they're going to have probably the biggest impact on how that coffee tastes, depending on how they, when they remove the seeds from the cherry, how long they then let the seeds and that mucilage, that sticky stuff, it's filled with sugar, so how long they let that sugar ferment into then how they dry their coffee, and so all those things like create a huge factor in how it tastes.
Wow. We're talking to Tony Auger. He's Chief Coffee Officer for Goshen Coffee here in the St. Louis area. And this is Arnold Stricker with Mark Langston of St. Louis in Tune. Go into that. I want to get into the weeds of this because I find this fascinating. I always want to make a better cup of coffee. We have a French roast or French press, and experiment around with the grinder and all that stuff like that. But when you talk about the farmer who is pulling away the fruit from this, is this done mechanically? Is this done by hand?
Yeah.
Does it depend on the country?
It's always done mechanically. It would be like way too labor intensive to do anything different. And so what you can picture is kind of like a circular, like a cylinder that has like cheese grater like ridges on it, and there's like a basket that sits above that, and they put the cherries on top of there, and either through like a mechanical belt that will then spin around over and over again, and the cherries slowly drip into that, and then spit out the seeds, and the fruit and like skin on that fruit kind of shoots out in a different direction.
What do they do with that pulp and stuff?
There's a couple different things they can do. A lot of people will let their chickens kind of eat it or pick through it. It also makes really good fertilizer. So the one thing you'll see if you ever are able to visit farms in a lot of these countries that grow coffee is that they try to reuse as much as possible. So fertilizer is huge. That will go back into like a compost bin of some sort, and they'll be able to distribute that with all the awesome nutrients from coffee back into the coffee fields. Or you can even do one more thing with it. You can make what's called cascara tea. But in order to do that, you really have to like dry it in a way where you're not going to get like microorganisms.
So they don't make energy bars and sell them
anymore.
at the local store.
Not anymore. But no, I would say like most of the time it goes back into like a compost bin of some sort.
So you've got Arabica beans, and those are like Africa and like Brazil, South America, Central America. And then you have Asian beans. I can't remember the name of that bean.
So really, so we have 2 main. We'll call them family tree varieties.
Okay.
They spew from the same, overarching family tree. But those two main branch offs are going to be Arabica and Robusta. Robusta is grown mostly in like Vietnam, in Asia a little bit, but honestly, it's grown everywhere. You see
Really?
it in Brazil a lot too.
Okay.
The main difference is that Arabica does not produce as much quantity of coffee, and it's more susceptible to diseases and different like spores that would come in and kind of like ruin the production of that coffee. But it tastes phenomenal. While Robusta does not have a great taste traditionally, however, it has a great crop yield. So you'll see a lot of places like, they'll say like world's strongest cup of coffee. Most of the time that's going to be Robusta coffee, just because it actually also has more caffeine content. It's one of those things where you kind of have to like weigh the pros and cons, but due to quality, really Goshen and all my kind of supply chain knowledge, we only really use Arabica beans.
Okay. Has anybody tried to do some kind of cross-pollination
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of research going into that right now, and you'll see a lot, we call them hybrids. You'll see them kind of scattered across Latin America. Really the main reason why is for the past 10 years, even longer than that, one huge thing has been at first fighting what's called coffee leaf rust. It's this fungus that can transfer really easily between farms, and it basically hurts the plant, and the plant like goes into survival mode, but in a different way. It stops producing cherries altogether and tries to fix itself. And then in addition to that, they've been working on trying to find coffees that can survive climate change. And Robusta is one of those ones that's shown a little bit more ability to resist the huge swings in climate. So there's been a lot of research in combining those to create like a higher quality coffee that is like, a little bit more easy to not have some of the issues that have faced Arabica coffee.
Okay, so the farmer gets these beans. He's run them through that little machine to take off the pulp, what I'm going to call the pulp.
Yep.
He's got the beans, and does the farmer roast them? Or?
No. So what will happen next is that coffee is those seeds are kind of left with that mucilage on the outside of it.
And describe what that exactly is.
Yeah, so it's sticky. It's super flavorful. It's very, very sweet. So think of like let me see, like the best kind of fruit to maybe describe it as is, I don't know, like maybe a pomegranate seed.
Okay.
Like, and you have like kind of a juiciness around the outside of it.
Okay.
There's probably way better examples, but or like chia seed, when you soak it in water,
Okay.
it kind of has that little pearl that kind of grows around it.
Right.
So that what we're going to do with that is actually go through a fermentation process. Fermentation in coffee, it has to be done in some way. One way is to go through this process where they remove the cherry skins, and then like soak that mucilage with the coffee seed still, and they'll let that ferment. And it varies dramatically based on like local temperatures and environments, but the idea is you need that to ferment for somewhere around 12 to 24 hours before you then wash it all off completely to stop that fermentation.
Okay.
The other way that coffee can be processed, and this is just one or two where there's like hundreds of ways, but the other main way is what's called a natural or a dry process, and that is when they actually leave the cherry intact, and they'll turn it into like kind of a raisin and let it dry out. That results in like an amplification of like fruit flavors drastically. Like if I was to make like a latte or even just a cup of coffee, someone might think that like I put like a blueberry syrup inside of it. It tastes that much like blueberries. It's really cool. But the downside of it, it's a lot harder to do. And so obviously if you like over ferment something, you're going to get over fermented fruit flavors, which can really be off-putting.
Unless people like kind of fruit-flavored coffee.
Right.
Very labor intense, it seems like.
Incredible.
Yeah, that's why I wanted him to go through this, because we go to the store and we buy beans or we buy ground coffee, and we just do what we want to do in the morning.
Think much of it.
Kind of destroy it. Yeah,
No, for sure.
I don't know why they're not charging more for coffee.
You're telling me. I mean, once you see what happens on the ground, it's very insane, to be honest with you.
And I heard that there was a shortage, I guess, a couple of years ago.
Yeah, we have big up and downs.
Okay, that's good to know. It kind of comes up too.
Yeah, it really depends. It's it's a global market type thing, and Brazil right now they pretty much can control the global market. So they make the most coffee in the world, and if Brazil says, "Hey, our harvest isn't going to be that well this year," then the whole market goes into panic. Or if they say we're going to have too much coffee, then again the whole market goes into panic. So,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, when you think about all it takes, I mean, just a coffee plant itself, like from the time it grows into a little tiny comes from a nursery and goes into the ground, it's going to take 3 years just for that coffee to make cherries.
Wow.
So farmers have to, and they're spread very thin.
And they probably have a lifetime on there when they're really producing the best.
Kind of. Yeah, it goes back to that same thing where I was talking about kind of like freaking the plant out. So if you have the plant do a lot of trimming, so you're taking off, or even you can stump the tree entirely, it's going to cause the plant to kind of grow back and produce more coffee again. Because on the branches themselves where the coffee is grown, that's the only time coffee will grow on that spot. So you have to start removing branches so that way it can keep producing.
Oh, wow. Okay. Fascinating.
So you would, as a chief coffee officer, and somebody would go to these farms and say, "Hey, I like your beans," or "Tell me about your beans," and that's how all that kind of process happens?
Yeah, a little bit. It's the romanticized version. But really, so before moving to Goshen, my background was in supply chains. And so I worked a lot in Latin America, and I saw that it's not that easy in any way.
Wow.
So I mean, there's we could do 2 episodes on how on how hard it is to find those relationships. But the great thing about my background is then being able to take those relationships I formed,
absolutely,
and have a much more transparent view on what it's going to take to get, and how much it's going to take to get the coffee from point A to point B.
Right. Okay. Well, we're going to keep kind of talking about that. I don't want people to tune out, because I do want to also let them know that you were participating in the U.S. Coffee Championships in Portland, Oregon recently, in the coffee roasting category and the cup tasting category. Oh, wow. And we will talk about that, but I also want to continue our conversation about how somebody, when they get up in the morning, they can make a better cup of coffee, and what are all of the factors involved in that. So I'm kind of teasing our listeners here that we're going to go a couple different directions, and I like that apparently this championship in Portland was like the Oscars.
Oh,
yeah, it's a big deal. And then the winners there went on to the international coffee championship, the World Coffee Championship in Greece and Taiwan. I was like, I'm just learning so much.
Yeah,
there's.
Sure.
We're just beginning to scratch the surface of the bean. How about that?
Right.
Okay. All right. So we'll be right back to talk about all of those things that we mentioned. You're listening to St. Louis in Tune with Arnold Stricker and Mark Langston on the U.S. Radio Network.
St. Louis in Tune strives to bring you informative, useful, and reflective stories and interviews about current and historic issues and events that involve people, places, and things. Our topics cover a wide range, such as the arts, crime, education, employment, faith, finance, food, health, history, housing, humor, justice, and even sports. And that's just to name a few. While St. Louis in Tune originates from the Gateway City and covers local topics, we connect to what is going on nationally as well. If you enjoy what you hear, please take time and like and share and subscribe to this show and listen to other previous shows that can be found on our website, stlintune.com. That's stlintune.com. Or on your favorite podcast platform. That's stlintune.com. stlintune.com. And if you've got an idea that you'd like for us to examine a little deeper, let us know by dropping us a note at stlintune@gmail.com. That's stlintune@gmail.com. St. Louis in Tune, heard Monday through Friday on the usradionetwork.com and many great radio stations around the U.S. and, of course, right here in St. Louis. Our website again is stlintune.com. We want to hear from you. stlintune.com.
This is Arnold Stricker of St. Louis in Tune on behalf of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision was a major legal event and catalyst that contributed to the Civil War. The decision declared that Dred Scott could not be free because he was not a citizen. The 14th Amendment, also called the Dred Scott Amendment, granted citizenship to all born or naturalized here in our country and was intended to overturn the U.S. Supreme Court decision on July 9, 1868. The Dred Scott Heritage Foundation is requesting a commemorative stamp to be issued from the U.S. Postal Service to recognize and remember the heritage of this amendment by issuing a stamp with the likeness of the man Dred Scott. But we need your support and the support of thousands of people who would like to see this happen. To achieve this goal, we ask you to download, sign, and share the one-page petition with others. To find the petition, please go to dredscottlives.org and click on the Dred Scott Petition Drive on the right side of the page. On behalf of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, this has been Arnold Stricker of St. Louis in Tune. Welcome back to St. Louis in Tune. This is Arnold Stricker with Mark Langston. We're talking to Tony Auger. He's the Chief Coffee Officer for Goshen Coffee here in the St. Louis metropolitan area. And there are two locations. One's down in Soulard, and the other one is in Illinois?
Yeah, in Edwardsville, Illinois, where Goshen was founded.
Okay. And we've been talking about this whole process of coffee, and we left it off where Tony's going down and he's established relationships, and he has purchased some, tons of beans, I'm presuming, and now he gets them back here to the States. And what do you do with those beans?
Yeah, the first thing that coffee is going to go through is like an approval process. So really just tasting the coffee and, through our database, ensuring that like what we're getting in as a sample or, what coffee's arriving actually matched what was originally offered. But from there, we then start profiling a coffee. So each one of our coffees, whether it be a blend or single origin coffee, we're going to go through and make fine-tuned details to it to kind of amplify what we think is inherently good about that coffee. So with our blends, a lot of that is maybe tweaking the percentages of coffee going into different blends, but it's also crazy things like how long we want the coffee to roast. So generic, as a big generic statement, the longer you roast a coffee, the less bright and fruit forward it's going to be. And the higher temperatures you roast coffee at, you're going to get more of the smoky, charred kind of flavors. So we try to make coffees that people want, regardless of their preferences. So we have a wide range of light roast and medium roast and dark roast. But really for us, it's trying to take the individuality of that coffee and find the best way to showcase it. Right.
And there's dry roasting, and what other kind of roasting is there?
So there's a bunch of different styles. So there's air roasting, which is just hot air pushing through. And then you also have, convective heat roasting and conduction heat type of roasting. And these are going to be more like where the fire itself doesn't touch the actual coffee beans themselves, but it heats it up in a certain way. So it can have like a radiant heat where everything is kind of emitting that energy and that heat from a metal. It could have a direct heat source where we call that like actual physical contact. So if the coffee bean itself is on the metal that's heated up rather than spinning around. At Goshen, what I really like and how I've kind of presented our coffees is we use a hybrid between a traditional drum roaster. So we have a barrel that kind of spins around, but there's no direct heat. So the only direct heat would be that every once in a while a bean will kind of hit the paddles on that roaster. We use like a roaster that has like an internal air system where it kind of keeps that hot air. The really cool thing about it is, while I also think it does create like a much better quality product because you're penetrating that really dense coffee seed with hot air, so it gets to the center of it and it roasts the outside and the middle kind of the same way.
Makes sense.
But it also uses way less energy. So when we switched to that roaster, we saw a 95% decrease in our energy consumption.
Wow.
Yeah. Hello.
Yep. Yeah. So it's a good thing for all type of thing.
That's wild. That's fascinating as to how that all works. And so do you pull it out of the drum and
just like spread it out to cool,
Yeah.
or do you like have a cooling machine?
Yeah, so right when the coffee hits the temperature that we want, and I mean it's a really small window with a lot of these coffees, we're going to immediately have the door open of the roasting machine, and it's going to tumble out into a cooling tray, and so that cooling tray is sucking all the hot air down and pushing it out to the outside world, but it also has arms that spin it to make sure it doesn't stay in one spot.
Wow. So then it goes from that conveyor belt to like bags? Or?
Yeah. So we'll move from that machine, and once the coffee's cooled, we'll send it over to our packaging line. The packaging line is this awesome thing that sucks the coffee up to a weigh-in fill, and as it's doing that, it's also checking for like any kind of foreign objects. And then from there, we have people that are working on bagging that coffee. So they'll either be bagging 5 pounds for our wholesale customers, 2-pound bags, or like 12-ounce bags.
Wow. Okay. Now, to the point that people have been probably waiting for is how do I make... I'm buying Goshen coffee, which is available, folks, at most retail grocers here in the metropolitan area. I'll mention some: Schnucks, Dearborg, Straub's, Whole Foods, Fresh Time, other
I'm going to go get some,
retailers.
too.
Yeah, I am, too.
I'm going to go get some.
I am, too. And there's a whole wide variety, Mark, so we're going to have to really ask them after the show which one we probably should try first.
A whole nother show on this.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
We haven't even talked about Irish cream and coffee or any of that.
He's probably
Coffee cocktails, are delicious, yeah.
So how do I make a better cup of coffee?
Yeah.
There's a lot that goes into that rather than the percolator and
Right.
I don't care
whatever.
for Keurig coffee either. I don't mean to bring the brand
Yeah.
out, but those little pre-made cups, I don't...
There's a couple reasons why some people don't like those, and it does tie into all the different steps that kind of goes about it. So really what I always tell people, the absolute best way to improve your coffee taste dramatically is by making sure that you're using filtered water. That's first and foremost.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So there's, unfiltered waters, they're going to have like different, chemical compounds that are made up in that water. And so if we brew coffee in Edwardsville that isn't, that's just using Edwardsville tap water, and we brew the same exact coffee in Soulard using just St. Louis City water, they're going to taste so different. You're not even going to be able to think they're the same coffee. And it's just because flavor molecules will adhere to different organic compounds in a different way.
Wow.
So to try to get the flavor to be really similar, you're going to want to use filtered water.
Fascinating.
The next thing from there is making sure you're using the correct grind size for the brewing apparatus. So if you're using something like a French press, you want to have a very coarse grind, and that's because the coffee is kind of steeping rather than being brewed. And if you're using something like a drip brewer, you want to have a little bit finer of a grind, particle size a little bit smaller, and that's because water is constantly coming through and passing through the coffee.
As opposed to the French press where it's just kind of
exactly.
You're pushing it through.
Yeah, and so like really the easy way to think about it is, the larger a coffee particle size is, the more the water is going to have to penetrate that little particle size in order to fully extract. But the smaller it is, it's going to take a lot less water and a lot of less contact time because there's already less of a shape for the water to kind of come through.
Okay.
Yep.
Interesting. Okay, so now we've talked about beans, and obviously it has to be fresh coffee.
Right.
It's better to grind it.
Yeah, right away. And I always give the comparison of like bread. If you bought pre-sliced bread and you didn't leave it in the bag, it's going to get stale pretty fast. But if you bought a loaf of bread and then cut just enough for you to use each time, that center of the bread is gonna stay really consistently, soft and delicious.
Right.
Same thing with coffee. The when we start making that particle of the coffee bean smaller and smaller, it is going to be more places for air to kind of reach that coffee. And as soon as air starts reaching, it just starts deteriorating the flavor compounds.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the best thing to do is to be able to have coffee in a bag that's stored really away from sun, away from heat, kind of just a normal temperature, and grind it as you need it. But really, I tell people, like, if you don't have a grinder, I would say buy like 2 weeks worth of coffee. And you're going to see after 2 weeks of ground coffee is going to start to deteriorate in flavor.
No kidding. And do you keep it in the refrigerator or anything? Is that a bad thing, good thing?
So there's a lot of back and forth about that right now. The problem is with with the standard household refrigerators and freezers, they don't get cold enough to make a difference. If anything, it actually can make it worse because you're producing condensation,
Right.
moving and
That's
and
what
putting
I was
back in.
thinking when
And
you said that.
Condensation's water.
Right.
So
Yeah.
So grinders, people, it's like the magic bullet, or there's some real good grinders
Right.
out there. You have to do your research on that.
Yep.
What are some factors that people need to look for in a grinding
yeah,
machine?
so with a grinder, I would really recommend staying away from almost like more of a spice type grinder. The main reason for that is because you're going to get particle sizes that are all over the place. You'll get some chunks, you'll get some super fine particles. So what we tend to recommend to people is like what's called a conical burr grinder, which can have a much more uniform and precise way of grinding. But you could find them anywhere now. Even Target and Walmart, they have very cheap versions. And I would recommend, if it's something you don't want to invest in, that's like too much money in, because the grinder I have at home is, my wife killed me when she saw the price. But
Yeah, but you're the chief
I
coffee
know,
officer.
That's what I tell her. I was like, why do you think your coffee tastes so good in the morning? But
Yeah,
Love
give
it.
me that magic bullet and you'll find out the difference.
Right. But there are a lot of cheaper alternatives. You just have to make sure it's a conical burr grinder instead.
And you can how do I say this? You can overheat water, put the
Yep.
water on. It's too hot. It's not right. It needs to be just right. Like
Right.
that.
Same thing.
That fable.
You really don't want to use like boiling water because that's too hot. So again, the one thing that the water comes into play is extraction. So the hotter something is, the more it's going to extract. When you start to extract too much flavors out, you're going to get like bitter tastes. And so you really want to kind of be in this range of like 195 to, I would say, maxing out at like 212. But even then, that's pretty hot. I brew my coffee at home around like 205 degrees, 208 degrees.
And you have temperature gauges that actually.
Yeah, there's what I use is like it's a kettle, and it has like an electric reader on it that just kind of tells you. But most of the time I tell people, like, if you don't have something like that, if you're just using hot water coming off a stove, just let it boil, and then after it boils, wait like a minute, and then you can brew your coffee.
Okay. Now, I know this is also an interesting factor, is the amount of water that you put with the coffee. I've always thought, like when I was growing up, when I'd see somebody with a little espresso kind of cup, or like a Turkish coffee with very small, like a demi-tasse cup, that, okay, well, they're using maybe not as much coffee and just a little bit of water. And it's like an intense coffee, and it's the amount of water. So talk about that balance and that ratio.
So like in our cafes, almost every coffee you'll get is going to have the same amount of coffee, right? So the caffeine doesn't change. What changes is the concentrate level. So with an espresso, you're using about like 21, 19, somewhere in the small 20s grams of coffee to make just that 2 ounces of espresso. While if you get a cup of coffee that's made for just specifically you, what we call a pour over, that's going to be 12 ounces, and it's going to have roughly the same amount of coffee that kind of goes into that. We use, when you're brewing just coffee itself, we use what's called like the golden ratio in coffee, and that's 1:16. So unfortunately in the U.S., we don't have a very easy system to monitor that, but if you convert everything to the metric system, that would be 1 gram to 16 milliliters, right? So 1 gram of coffee for every 16 milliliters. The great thing about milliliters is that 1 milliliter of water is actually equal to 1 gram weight-wise. Which makes brewing coffee very easy.
All right, now say that again, because I never really learned
No,
the
no,
metric
you're good.
system very well.
I don't want to learn it.
Yeah, no, I know. It's whenever we do these like whenever I go and travel, it's like, oh my gosh, if I just knew the metric system, everything would be a lot easier for coffee. But no, so what we do is, 1 gram of coffee to 16 milliliters of water.
Okay.
Right. But we've made that easier. So on the sides of our bags, we have things in like tablespoons and ounces and stuff like that.
And cups.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay. For those of us who refuse to, to learn the system.
Right.
Okay. So and brewing time.
Yep.
I was reading about the French press that 2 minutes. Or 4 minutes? Or?
So I would recommend everyone just check out our site. I've kind of put together a bunch of like brew card recipes from anywhere to a French press, or making a pour over, or if you just have a at home drip machine, the best way to kind of make your coffee based on like what you have.
Right.
But really time does play a huge factor, again, because we're talking about the extraction levels. So if we extract for a long period of time, that's going to create a bitter cup of coffee. If we extract too short, you're going to get sour and weak flavors. So we really want to have, based on that brew method, a window that coffee should be brewed in. So on your at-home machine, I would say between an at-home drip machine, 3.5 minutes to 4.5 minutes. Where if you were doing a French press, I want to say the best as I see around 4 minutes. Something that you're doing as a pour over, you want to get closer to 3.5 minutes. But then you can make espresso in 25 seconds. So it just kind of depends on the application.
Okay. So that website, folks, GoshenCoffee.com, GOSHEN coffee.com, and there's pages on brewing instructions. Now, you mentioned something.
Give that one more time.
Yeah. Goshen, GOSHEN coffee.com, GOSHEN coffee.com, and pages and brewing instructions. You go to the tab, you can find that. You mentioned pour overs, and that's with like a filter.
Yeah,
and I've seen that, and it's kind of it's supposedly supposed to be real, and it is really good cup of coffee.
Yeah. So the main difference when you're making a pour over, it's really you're making a one serving, and so the reason that those can taste a lot better is you're just putting a lot of attention to detail. It looks a lot harder than it is.
You're not mass producing.
No, you're not mass producing. But the outcome is that you have an incredibly fresh cup of coffee.
Yeah.
That was brewed at the perfect temperature, the perfect grind size. You can control a lot of those variables a lot more, and that's how I make coffee every morning. I use a brewer called a Chemex. That's my favorite because I'm able to brew just enough coffee for my wife and I to have a full cup. And that's a brewer that's been around for a long time. I want to say the 50s is when they started featuring those. And it's pretty easy, to be honest. You're able to teach somebody how to brew on something like that very quickly.
Okay, well, I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, well, when we make coffee at home in the morning, we're always conscious because we keep the pot on for a couple of hours.
Yep.
So we're worried that, by the time we get to the last couple of cups, it's getting pretty bitter.
Yeah,
definitely. So we're always trying to find that balance of,
how much.
Yeah, maybe it's a little too weak when the first cup, but it's perfect by the last,
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to do, figure out.
Yeah, I mean, like if you think of the heat plates, you're basically making, a little bit of a syrup, because you're taking a liquid and you're removing some more of that moisture through it. That's how that's how I grew up drinking coffee. Yeah. so I'm used to it.
Yeah, we don't have a grinder at our house. Okay. And we just noticed the difference in store-bought coffee. It's amazing. We found I don't want to say the brand, but we bought actually it's a well-known brand. We've been buying a brand at Aldi's that's like and the real expensive fancy brand was terrible.
Yeah.
It was just terrible. It was like, we wanted to throw it out. So it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. All coffee is not the same.
Now, you could put salt in your bitter coffee, just a little bit of salt.
Oh, this was beyond salt.
And take
it down a little bit. Yeah. I think a lot of times it's, we, and something I really try to pride myself in is first and foremost buying, ethically sourced coffee that tastes delicious.
There you go.
With that,
good advice.
You can make a dark roast or you can make a light roast, and it's my idea is I want it to be the best version of dark, medium, or light.
Right.
The hard thing about coffee is that for a very long time, and we're just starting to get into it now, is like we're actually selling something that you have to make, right? Where if you look at a bottle of wine, this is it.
Yeah.
You consume it. And so education for us is like really important.
Huge, right?
If our customers don't know how to brew their coffee correctly, then they can think our coffee's terrible. And so, so for us, it's super important to have that education and those things on our website for people to be able to check out.
You've done a great job with that on the website. It's really lays it out well.
Thank
Because
you.
I was like, okay, do I have a drip coffee? Oh, I'm going to do a pour over. Oh, I have a French press. Oh, I have an AeroPress. What's an AeroPress?
Yeah, an AeroPress is more of like a concentrated brewer as well. It's kind of we always call it the fast and easy espresso. It's not going to give you actually espresso, but you're able to kind of get a really small amount of coffee incredibly quickly. So like 2 minutes maybe. I take that when I'm camping.
Now, we have to get into, because we're running out of time here, man, we could talk probably for another hour.
Yeah, easily.
The Coffee Championship. You just returned from there in 2 categories, coffee roasting and cup tasting. Describe what happened up there and how you went about doing all those things.
Yeah, so the roasting championship was a fun one. I actually made it to the semifinals in that competition. It was one that I actually helped create years ago, but it's gotten a lot harder since I did that, which is great. They've kind of tried to make it more of like that kind of adhere to the international standards. Again, international is working on metric system and a little bit different machinery, so it was a curveball for sure. But that competition's really hard. I don't know anything about the coffee at all until I get there. I have no idea what it is, how it tastes, anything. Show up and they say, "Hey, here's a pound of coffee. You can roast it now and taste it based on what you roasted, and then create a roast plan." And you don't get to taste the coffee again. You just have to roast it.
Wow!
And then it's blind evaluated by a national jury, and they look at your paperwork and see like, okay, he said he was going to do this for this reason. Did we actually taste that now?
Interesting.
And the machine that we roasted on was easily the hardest machine I've ever roasted on. It was a very weird one. So, but it was a lot of fun. The other competition's what's called the Cup Tasters competition. This is one you could practice for, but really it's my day-to-day job. So there's a little strategy involved in it, but really it's more just so they'll have 8 sets of triangles. So if, each triangle is 3 cups of coffee, and one of those cups is slightly different. And so you have 8 minutes to go through and decide which one out of those 3 are different. And again, you have to do that 8 times. And so once you taste them, you kind of take the different cup and you move it forward. I'm a speed guy, so I just threw my headphones on, listen to jazz. Makes me go fast, And first round to make it to the quarterfinals, I blew through the time. I did it in like 2.5 minutes, and I got 7 out of 8 right. But the next day, I tried to go even faster, because once you get to that national stage, like people. They go
it's
fast.
A time thing.
It's a time thing, yeah.
Okay.
So I could get all 8 right, but if someone got all 8 right in less time, then they're the winner. So I didn't do as good on the final round, but it was still a lot of fun.
Do you drink water in between or something?
Yeah, I have a little where I have a warm cup of water, and it kind of helps me reset
Cleanse
my palate.
the palate. Yeah.
Yeah, but because they're also using coffees that are like, they try very hard to trick you.
Okay.
So you'll have like 3 coffees that have like very high acidic like flavors, and one of them, instead of maybe like a lime flavor in it, you'll get more of a lemon flavor in it. And so if you're tasting them in a circle over and over again, you'll start to be like, I don't even know what I'm tasting anymore. So
Now, 2 more questions here.
Yeah.
Is there? Yeah, I've got a lot, but I'm looking at the clock here.
I'm
looking at the clock here. Flavored coffee, like you can buy that. Is that added on after the fact, or when is that added?
Yeah, so flavored coffee, it's actually just like an aromatic oil. So what happens is the coffee's roasted, it then goes into like kind of like a big cement mixer, and then like the aromatic oil is just kind of poured over it, and it keeps spinning around until it's evenly distributed. That's why you'll notice if you ever buy like whole bean of flavored coffee, it has like this really oily sheen on it. I would recommend if you buy flavored coffee to only buy it ground. especially if you were going to be grinding other coffees, because what will happen is those flavors will kind of stick to the grinding burrs, and you won't be able to get rid of that flavor. So yeah, I would always recommend, and it's really not going to taste. You're not going to taste staleness because there's so much like added flavor to it at that point.
Very interesting.
Oh, it's fascinating. Just absolutely fascinating.
Okay, interesting. And that's why sometimes my coffee tastes better. It tastes more flavorful, and sometimes because maybe the oils landed on a little bit more on some of the beans. Or?
If it's flavored coffee, might just be how much flavor was used sometimes.
Okay.
But really, like my job as a buyer and a roaster is I want to find ways for the coffee to taste flavorful without having to add anything to it.
Right.
So
does that include like sweetener or cream?
I mean, for me, if I'm able to make a cup of coffee that is the best cup of coffee, it's going to have a great body to it. We always say, like, if someone adds cream, or like they've been habitually adding like a cream or something like that to their coffee, it's more than likely because the first cup of coffee that they drank was super thin and not extracted properly. So adding that cream then gives you the round mouthfeel you're looking for with coffee.
Interesting.
Same thing with the sweetness. If that coffee isn't inherently sweet and it's bitter, you're going to want to add something to kind of counteract that. But really, through the roasting process and the coffee sourcing process, I can achieve those things. It's just more like how well other people can achieve it as well.
Right. So is there the best container to drink coffee out of? Is it porcelain? Is it glass?
I prefer porcelain. Just because it's so surprising. We go into studies with this all the time where, what you're drinking out of can impact the flavor or even just your impression of flavor, right? So if you're drinking out of something that's metal, it's going to taste more tingy, right? Something with glass, like it's great, but it actually loses its temperature really fast. Where porcelain has a really good job, and just even ceramic in general, of like keeping the heat kind of regulated.
Even plastic. I've got a plastic mug here.
You taste the plastic?
My to-go mug. It's different.
It's different.
It's different.
Even just the texture of what you're putting to your mouth will
different.
change your opinion.
So I put a little more Irish cream in it, and it's fine. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
That explains it.
I'm kidding. I do like Irish cream in my coffee, though.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah.
So
I'm not much on the flavored coffee at all.
Yeah.
I have to be honest. And I like the idea. I mean, I would put like just a hint of sugar if I had to get rid of the bitterness. But that's all I've ever done.
Yeah. I would say, I definitely recommend people just even swinging by any coffee shop and tasting their coffee black before.
Correct.
They put it in just to kind of get an idea.
I think that's a great advice. Yeah.
One thing I always tell people, like, we'll always have two coffees kind of on our drip brewer, and I'll say, this one's a little bit lighter, fruitier, brighter, whether the other one's more sweet and, just more of an average drinking cup of coffee. Which one do you want to try? And then, ask them, like, hey, before you put creamer in it, just take a sip and see if it's sweet enough for you already.
Can I tell you what's always scared me in the office? when you've got that coffee maker that's never been cleaned.
Oh, yeah. Actually, before filtered, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. Is that right? And then go get the bag. You got a bag. You peel that bag open and you just pour that coffee in and then brew it. And that coffee, I don't know where that coffe's from. I don't know. It's usually, I grow hair on the top of my hand.
And it grows hair after it sits there for a while.
It's scary. It's a scary thing to do.
It's a different world entirely. It's,
sometimes I'll thin it out. I won't put the whole bag in. Is that probably a bad thing to do? I don't know.
It's just because maybe the flavor isn't good, so you're just getting less flavor.
Yeah. Maybe that's best.
I'm actually a huge history buff, and I always try to tell people that, the United States, we love coffee.
Yeah.
Right? We're a coffee nation. We're not a tea nation. That's why we threw it overboard.
That's right.
We drink coffee. And so for a very long time, we actually treated coffee with a lot of respect. So even during the Civil War time, you would have someone on each troop that would be in charge of roasting and grinding the coffee fresh every day.
Wow.
There were actually little grinders that they would be able to store on their rifles. But because of, World War II and going into this age where, we stopped, it became more about it being a commodity. being able to have convenience. And so now we're finally getting back to this point where people realize, like, no, we can actually make a good cup of coffee. It won't take that much longer, but let's stop and let's have our morning ritual and enjoy this in a way where, like, we're putting our, we're waking up on the right side of the bed type of thing.
I was reading, and maybe you can verify this, I don't remember the website, that I think it's Norway actually drinks more coffee per capita than United States. And the United States not even on the top 10 of countries.
Is that that's crazy to me?
Well, I think one thing with Norway is they also use a lot of coffee per cup. Like those Scandinavian countries,
They're cold.
Yeah, they're very cold. But they also go for like really light roasts. And to kind of counteract that, they'll use more coffee.
Okay.
So like I was saying, we use like 1 part to 16 parts, where they'll use like 1 part to 10 parts. Type of thing. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing to me.
This has been fascinating.
And I can't start the day without a cup of coffee.
Right.
I've got to be honest with you.
Yep, I agree with you.
I'm just not, and it's not right. And sometimes I'll have 1 cup of coffee and I'm out the door, and it still isn't right. I need more than 1 cup of coffee.
Well, if I don't get one, I get the afternoon headache.
Really? And you get crabby. I've noticed you get really crabby.
I thought that's when I drank too much.
Right. Is that right? I noticed you get really crabby.
We need to have you back to talk more about this. Is just, I was just fascinating. I remember going to a wine, a vinter, and how they were going through making wine and everything, and this is as fascinating. And do you take tours through your roasting facility?
So we do tours. A lot of times they have to be scheduled ahead, but we, out in Edwardsville, we have a random person hop in every once in a while. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about it. Where we love to be humble, but we also love to geek out on coffee.
That's great.
So like I'll talk to somebody for hours and hours if they want to listen to it.
Well, we are glad that you like to talk about it, because this is we like to listen, and we're naturally inquisitive and want to know more about the topics we're talking about.
And that was great. Your last 2 questions, they went pretty good.
no pun intended there.
No, there was like 30 questions there, I'm afraid. Just kind of feed on it.
Inquiring minds want to know.
Yes, they do.
Which, it could go to our word of the day, what you were talking about. I do have about 1 minute and 45 seconds left here. I'm going through my notes to pull that up.
Yeah.
And the word of the day is paranomatia. Paranomatia.
Paranomatia.
The use of a word in a different sense, or the use of words similar in sound to achieve a specific effect as humor or making a pun. In other words, champagne for my real friends and real pain for my sham friends. I used to be a tap dancer until I fell in the sink. Let's see, how about this one? Award Wieners. It's a Hollywood hot dog stand in Disneyland.
Oh, no.
A good farmer is nothing more or less than a handyman with a sense of humus.
Wow. It's a tough room.
Yeah, it is a tough room. And we have 1 minute left, so I may be able to pull off a funny here.
All right.
I may be able to do that. We'll come up to our other things so later on. Folks, don't be so hard on yourself. The mom in E.T. had an alien living in her house for days and didn't even notice.
Oh, no. Wow. Gosh, you've got less than a minute.
I have less than a minute. Okay, so I might be able to do one more here. Quickly here. Let's see. Those are too long.
Okay.
Those are too long. Okay. Someone called the Kentucky Derby Amish NASCAR, and my day hasn't been the same.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
Well, that's all for this hour, folks. Get to Goshen Coffee and get some of that coffee. Thanks, Tony, for being
thank
on
you for
St.
having
Louis
me.
in
It was
Tune.
awesome.
Don't forget, when the Martians invade, I don't know if they drink coffee or not, but there's always only been one race, the human race, and every one of us have different characteristics and is uniquely valuable. For St. Louis in Tune, co-host Mark Langston, I'm Arnold Stricker. We're a production of Motif Media Group and the U.S. Radio Network. Remember to walk worthy and let your light shine.